We will now be moving to our final panel of today on preparing for success in future multilateral space security discussions. And I have the pleasure to introduce our moderator for this panel, Almudena Azcarate Ortega, who is a researcher at UNIDIR within the space security and WMD programs and a current doctoral candidate at Georgetown University. So Almudena, the floor is yours to start the last panel for today.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And thank you to everyone who's still with us here in person and virtually. Thank you also to our wonderful panelists who I will introduce in a minute. In the previous panels of today, we have talked about the different initiatives that exist and that have been proposed throughout the years to achieve the goal of the prevention of an arms race in outer space, or PAROS, as it is commonly known. As you know, this is a task that will not be achieved by one measure alone, and I believe that certain panelists mentioned this already in the previous panels. Rather, continued efforts will be needed as the space environment continues to evolve. In this sense, further work will be required to develop and sustain space security in the future, including through the work of the upcoming group of governmental experts on further practical measures for the prevention of an arms race in outer space, which is set to have its first session later this year. This GDE will consider and make recommendations on substantial elements of an international legally binding instrument on PAROS, including inter alia on the prevention of the placement of weapons in outer space. In this panel, we will consider how best to build on past initiatives, such as the ones that were discussed in the previous panel number 2, and also how we can prepare for the success of this GD as well as other future initiatives. And to do that, we have 5 remarkable experts with us today. Firstly, to my immediate left, we have Michael Spies. Michael has, as most of you probably know, he has extensive experience at the United Nations. He joined the UN in 2009, and he's currently the Deputy Chief of the Geneva branch of the Office for Disarmament Affairs. He currently leads the Secretariat's team on the Conference on Disarmament, as well as the Office's outer space portfolio. From 2013 to 2023, he also worked in the Science and Technology Unit. Before then, he provided substantive support to several UN processes, such as the United Nations Conference to negotiate a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons. Secondly, and joining us virtually, we have Konstantin Vorontsov, who is the Deputy Director of the Department for Non-Proliferation and Arms Control at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation. This is a position that he has held since July 2022. And before then, he was the head of the Multilateral Disarmament Bureau the Department for Non-Proliferation and Arms Control at the Russian MFA. He has also served in multiple capacities at the Military and Political Bureau of the Russian Permanent Mission to NATO. Next up, we have Jessica Tock, also joining us here in person. She's the Senior Space Multilateral Affairs Advisor for the Office of the Secretary of Defense and Space Policy. She has served in the US Department of Defense for over 17 years. She was the Space Policy Analyst from 2009 to 2011 and Senior Space Multilateral Affairs Advisor for the Office of the Secretary of Defense Space Policy since 2017. Next to her, we have Bassem Hassam. He is the Minister Plenipotentiary Director and also the Director of the Department of Disarmament and Peaceful Uses of Nuclear Energy. He has previously served as at the Egyptian mission to the UN in New York, where he was responsible for issues pertaining to the disarmament as well as international security, and also issues related to conflicts in the Middle East on the Security Council's agenda. He has served as Vice Chair to the First Committee of the UN General Assembly, also Vice Chair of the UN Disarmament Commission, and Vice President of the Review Conference of the UN Programme of Action on Small Arms and Light Weapons. And also in his CV, particularly significant to space security are his appointments as a member of the 2019 GD on PAROS, as well as his posting at the Permanent Mission of Egypt to the UN and other international organizations in Vienna. Last but not least, we have to the far left Ambassador Jian Shen. He is the Ambassador for Disarmament Affairs of China, a position that he assumed just last month. So warmest welcome to Geneva and also to UNIDI's Outer Space Security Conference. We hope that this will be the first of many for you, Ambassador. Prior to his current posting, Ambassador Shen worked as a director of the Division of Nuclear Affairs in the Department of Arms Control of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He was also Chancellor for Disarmament Affairs in Geneva from 2011 to 2015, and thereafter Deputy Director General of the Department of Arms Control of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, supervising a broad array of disarmament issues. So, as you can see, we have a full panel of excellent experts. And to start the discussion today, I will ask speakers to share with me and with the rest of all of those present here in person and virtually some general views on the topic that we are here to discuss. We will then move on to a period of moderated discussions. And during this period, I will be asking some questions of my own in my capacity as moderator. But I also want to underscore that we are very keen to provide the audience with the opportunity to ask questions of their own. So I encourage participants here in person to raise their placards or their hands if they want to ask questions. And also for those of you joining us virtually, I encourage you to use the Q&A function on WebEx to post your questions. It might not be possible to get to all of you, but we will do our best to try. So first of all, let's go to our first panelist, which is right here next to me. Michael, you have been involved in the organization of the upcoming GDE, and you're very familiar with the substance as well. So I think it would be very useful to everyone here if we could start by asking us to provide a general overview of what this GDE initiative is. What is the mandate? What does it entail? How did we get here? And what do states seek to achieve with this initiative? The floor is yours.
All right, thank you so much, Almudena, and to UNIDIR for organizing this conference and inviting me to speak. Yeah, I would like to just sort of take this opportunity to, as the first speaker on this panel, just to provide a bit of a basic background in responding to the questions that Almudena just raised, particularly, what exactly is this thing called a GGE? What is its mandate? And I think, importantly, what is the work that it has, accomplished in its previous iteration, and how will it relate to other initiatives, past, present, and future? I think these are all really excellent questions that are quite timely at this moment. So in terms of a GGE, a group of governmental experts, these are bodies that are quite unique to the field of disarmament and the practice of disarmament. They are established by the General Assembly, which requests the Secretary General to actually establish under his auspices a group of experts, normally specified as governmental experts, that are nominated from member states. And so these groups, which convene under the auspices of the Secretary General, is a formula that allows its members to meet in an informal setting, and to speak as much as possible in an individual capacity and informed from their national backgrounds. Typically, these groups meet in private, although in recent years we've seen trends towards increasing inclusivity in their working methods. So this might involve extensive interaction with external non-state experts who might be invited to interact with the group, the solicitation of formal inputs from all UN member states, the convening of intersessional consultative meetings that might provide segments for both all member states to provide their inputs, and also for other stakeholders as well. The outcomes of groups of this nature can also be quite varied. We've seen, one example in this field, recommendations on measures that can be endorsed by the UN member states. This is what we saw with the 2013 group on transparency and confidence building measures. We also see groups that elaborate recommendations on concepts that can be taken forward in a member state led or an intergovernmental process, like, for instance, the expert group that started the process that led to the Arms Trade Treaty. You have other types of groups that might review and further develop UN mechanisms or instruments, like we have with the Register on Conventional Arms or the Military Expenditure Instrument, or like in the case of the cyber security issue, we have groups that work toward, over time, to progressively develop norms, rules, and principles of responsible state behavior. And so you can see that the outputs of these groups are quite varied. Modena also already mentioned the mandate of the group established pursuant to Resolution 77-250. So its mandate is to consider and make recommendations on substantial elements of an international legally binding instrument on the prevention of an arms race in outer space, including inter alia on the prevention of the placement of weapons in outer space. And the Assembly further decided that the group will operate by consensus without prejudice to national positions in future negotiations, and it will meet in 2013 and 2014. Indeed, its first session will start on the 20th of November. Just one note, this mandate is identical to the group that convened in 2018 and 2019 in terms of its substantive elements. So what did the last GGE accomplish? I would say that despite the fact that it ultimately did not agree on a substantive report, it was nonetheless a useful exercise because it allowed space for its experts to hold technical discussions on key concepts, approaches, and terms, some of which have been debated, but without much progress in other bodies, particularly the Conference on Disarmament. And in that sense, it was able to really go down into some of these terms, including ones that we've heard already, that continue to not really have a common meaning, like a weapon in space, and really discuss what those might mean and how you could build possible elements of measures around them. And in so that sense, despite the fact that the group didn't agree on this report, it's interesting just to sort of note, based off its discussions of elements that could be included in basic obligations, these included areas such as use of force, attack on space objects, attacks against terrestrial infrastructure related to outer space objects, developing, testing, stockpiling, and deploying weapons, placement of any weapons in outer space, acts inconsistent with the legally binding instrument, or use of transfer or of dual-use equipment, technology, and materials. And so I give this list as sort of an indicative example of some of the topics because I think they're going to be relevant to how the work of this body, I think, relates to other bodies, and I'll come to that in just one moment. In terms of just sort of a couple general comments about how this GG can relate to or complement or benefit from other work streams. In the first instance, I think it's important to know that there has been consensus for some time that the prevention of an arms race in outer space can be pursued in multiple tracks. For instance, the consensus resolution on PAROS and the General Assembly, introduced by Sri Lanka and Egypt, its latest iteration was 7740, recognizes that negotiations for the conclusion of international agreement or agreements to prevent an arms race in outer space remain a priority task for the Conference on Disarmament, and that concrete proposals on confidence-building measures could form an integral part of such agreements. So, again, pointing to the complementarity of different types of measures, and alluding to the fact that these don't need to be necessarily even contained in a single instrument. Similarly, the report of the 2013 GG on TCBMs endorsed the pursuit of political commitments, for example, in the form of unilateral declarations, bilateral commitments, or a multilateral code of conduct to encourage responsible actions in and the peaceful use of outer space. And again, it affirmed, as other speakers have said so far in this conference, that voluntary political measures can form the basis for the consideration of concepts and proposals for legally binding obligations. And so, moving forward, and so we are just a couple of weeks out of the conclusion of the open-ended working group on reducing space threats. And again, I want to list the headings of the measures that the group had considered as possible recommendations. So those included damage and destruction of space objects or the use of space objects as weapons, development and deployment of space objects for hostile purposes, interference with the normal and safe operation of space objects, protection of critical space-based services, assistance and encouragement in certain acts, military space policies, doctrines and strategies, implementation of international obligations, commitments and measures, notification of defense and security exercises, and consultative mechanisms. So one takeaway from this is that you notice there's a bit of similarity, right, with the concepts that was discussed in a group that had a very different mandate, the DGE. There's a lot of overlap in these discussions, but also there are new issues that the OEWG was able to address and to further explore. In any case, I think it sort of gives some examples of how these different bodies can really contribute to developing a total and common understanding in these areas. Finally, just in concluding, just want to note that the policy brief by the Secretary General also envisioned multiple complementary tracks, which can be pursued sequentially or in parallel. This notion of sequencing is important, not because there is any intent to suggest a precondition in the pursuit of any tracks, but rather a practical need to work to avoid any unnecessary duplication of effort and to ensure the maximum coordination between the work of these bodies, taking into account the capacity of all delegations interested in contributing to these processes. So with that in mind, we still do believe that the Summit of the Future remains a possible opportunity for seeking a unified agreement on all of these tracks, and we are certainly will remain committed from the perspective of the UN Office for Disarmament Affairs and encouraging how all of these existing bodies can take advantage of this opportunity to move all of these issues forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. I think that was an excellent overview that really sets us in a really good position to introduce our next panelist. I would like to say, though, I really liked what you that the fact that you didn't just talk about the the GG, but you also mentioned other initiatives, and you talked about this issue of complementarity and about how we can this process can benefit from other work streams or from other processes that we've seen in the past. And I think this exemplifies this idea of how there is no one solution that's going to solve every single space security problem, and how we have to see these different processes, this GD included, as a sort of building block that is taking us closer to that ultimate goal, which would be PAROS. So I would like to give the floor to our virtual speaker now, Mr. Konstantin Vorontsov. I know that the Russian Federation is one of the states that voted in favor of Resolution 77-250. So I would be interested, and I'm sure the rest of those here today would also be interested in hearing your views on this process. What are your expectations for this upcoming GD? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, distinguished Ms. Azcarate Ortega, distinguished colleagues, honorable panelists. I'm glad to welcome all the participants in the annual UNIDIR Outer Space Security Conference. I would like also to thank the organizers of the conference for the efforts they have made in order to make it happen, including the hybrid format. And I appreciate the opportunity they provided to share the vision of further steps to achieve the goal of the prevention of an arms race in outer space, including the elaboration of a relevant legally binding instrument. As an author of a number of fundamental PAROS initiatives, Russia has steadily contributed to keeping outer space free from any weapons and preventing it from being converted into another area of tensions and armed confrontations. We have consistently supported preserving outer space for exclusively peaceful activities for all states on the basis of equality. However, these days the risk of outer space being transformed into a springboard for aggression and war is beginning to materialize. Some Western states have pursued a course towards placing weapons in outer space, building capabilities for the use of force against spaced objects, primarily through the development of weapon systems intended for the threat or use of force in, from, and against outer space, and using outer space for combat operations, which further undermines international peace and security, destabilizes the situation in outer space, and continues to have negative effect on advancing towards the goal of PAROS. These circumstances enhance the relevance of the initiatives aimed at preserving outer space for exploration and use for peaceful purposes, preventing an arms race and launching appropriate negotiations in the spirit of the 1967 Outer Space Treaty as envisaged by the decisions of the first special session of the General Assembly devoted to disarmament held in 1978. In this context, it is important to understand that unless reliable guarantees of keeping outer space free from weapons to be enshrined in an international legally binding agreement on PAROS are provided, addressing issues related to peaceful uses of outer space and ensuring the security of outer space activities would be futile. For these purposes, in 2008, the Russian Federation and China submitted for consideration by the Conference on Disarmament a draft treaty on the prevention of the placement of weapons in outer space and the threat or use of force against outer space objects, PPWT, and in 2014 introduced its updated version, taking into account comments and proposals made by some states. We view transparency and confidence building measures in outer space activities as an interim measure to be taken until this legally binding instrument to ensure predictability of a strategic situation in outer space is elaborated. We believe that the UN member states should implement these measures in their national practices on a voluntary basis to the fullest extent possible and practicable, and in a manner consistent with their national interests. At the same time, we would like to stress that the TCBMs should complement, not substitute for, an effective legally binding framework pertaining to outer space. We take note of the fact that this vision, which was first put forward in the final report of the Group of Governmental Experts on TCBMs back in 2013, has been upheld in the recommendations to promote the practical implementation of TCBMs with the goal of PAROS, consensually adopted by the United Nations Disarmament Commission earlier this year. We welcome the meaningful results achieved by the UNDC at the end of its 3-year cycle. And we share the common understanding that TCBMs in outer space have an important role to play as pillar of an international legally binding instrument on PAROS. TCBMs should aim to completely prohibit the placement of weapons in outer space, the threat or use of force against or by means of outer space objects. These very measures seek inter alia to ensure the resolution of disputes related to the implementation of a possible future Paris Treaty. The international initiative, political commitment on no first placement of weapons in outer space remains the only effective TCBM in outer space to prevent the placement of weapons in outer space. And this initiative aims to maintain international peace, ensure equal and indivisible security for all, and improve predictability and sustainability of states' activities in the peaceful exploration and use of outer space. More than 30 states have already become its full participants, and their numbers steadily growing. All states joining the NFP initiative would in fact lead to a new global political commitment not to place weapons in outer space, thus rendering impractical the development of both space strike weapon systems and anti-satellite defense capabilities. We are convinced that globalizing the political commitment on NFP would constitute a meaningful confidence-building measure in states' outer space activities. We regard the NFP as a step towards an international legally binding instrument that would contain safeguards against the placement of strike weapon systems in Earth orbit. The Russian Federation annually submits to the UNGA First Committee for consideration the draft resolutions on no first placement of weapons in outer space, transparency and confidence-building measures in outer space activities, and further practical measures for the prevention of an arms race in outer space. We intend to submit the updated drafts at the 78th UN General Assembly session. And when preparing the documents, we draw on the experience gained in the field of PAROS, as well as the outputs of various relevant multilateral formats. We are calling on all states to support and co-sponsor these draft resolutions. We would like to focus attention on the dangerous tendency among a number of states to use commercial space systems for purposes other than those declared when the systems were put into orbit. There are increasing reports of civilian spacecraft being turned into a tool for interfering in internal affairs of independent states and addressing other geopolitical goals. This creates grave risks for the safety of space operations and the long-term sustainability of outer space activities, which in turn is fraught with negative consequences for numerous socio-economic processes on Earth that directly depend on space technologies. In this context, we plan to submit for consideration of the fourth committee of the 78th UNGA session a draft resolution on space technology for promoting peace. The document underlines the importance of using space infrastructure in keeping with the declared peaceful purposes. It further highlights the need for a strict compliance with international space law, including with regard to the non-discriminatory access of all states to the benefits of outer space. At the same time, we deem it essential to clearly distinguish between the issues of space exploration for peaceful purposes addressed by the UN Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space in Vienna and those pertaining to PAROS, which fall within the sphere of competence of the UN Disarmament Triad. Given the various initiatives on space security submitted by member states, including the so-called concept of responsible behavior in outer space, we consider it necessary to focus joint efforts on strengthening the discussion on PAROS and consolidating this discussion and generating a unifying agenda. These tasks are of particular need, taking into account the outcome of the relevant open-ended working group established by the UNGA Resolution 76/231. The group's failure to yield meaningful results shows that the debate within the OEWG, far from helping to bridge the positions of the member states, which was its initial purpose, has further divided the world community on how to achieve the goals of Paris. We therefore consider it useless to further discuss the said concept, let alone resuming the OEWG's work. The commitment made by Washington and a number of the like-minded states not to conduct destructive direct ascent anti-satellite missile testing deserves similar assessments. This measure is purely declaratory and will be of no positive practical value for Paris. In the light of the disappointing results of the OEWG, we expect that the group of governmental experts on Paris, established pursuant to the UNGA Resolution 77/250, to consider and make recommendations on possible elements of a relevant multilateral legally binding instrument, will give a new impetus to the international community's efforts in this area. I would like to emphasize that we do not view this GGE as a competing initiative to the concept of responsible behavior in outer space. On the contrary, we hope to use its momentum to make the work of this future group of governmental experts as comprehensive and unifying as possible. We hope that the GGE will be able to agree on consensus recommendations on the elements of a multilateral legally binding instrument to prevent forever the placement of weapons in outer space, the threat or use of force in, from, and against outer space, which in turn will make it possible to take a big step forward towards the Paris goal. All the preconditions for this are available. We believe it useful to build on the work conducted the previous years, including the 2019 draft report of the GGE on Paris. We regret to note that it was not adopted for purely political reasons due to the position of a single country expert. Nevertheless, it contains many provisions essential both for further work on Paris and for strengthening international peace and security. For my part, I would like to assure you of our absolute readiness to make a constructive contribution to the work of the new GGE. We are open to full-scale, transparent, and honest cooperation with both the chair of the group and all the nominated governmental experts. After the GGE completes its work, we believe it necessary to ensure continuity and consistency in the consideration of Paris issues, as well as predictability of such discussions over the long term. The inclusive nature of future activities in such a responsible area is essential. We believe there is a possibility to achieve meaningful results that can unite the UN member states in their endeavor to reach the Paris goals and to develop a relevant legally binding instrument envisaging as a fundamental element a ban on the placement of weapons in outer space and the threat or use of force in, from, and against outer space. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I was taking avid notes of everything you said, and I look forward to developing all of the points that you made further during the Q&A session. I would just like to remark one point that you made that I feel echoed something that Michael also mentioned. You talked about several initiatives that have been proposed in the past, such as the PPWT or the No First Placement Initiative, and you mentioned how these initiatives can also serve as inspiration, or states can rely on them or can use them as a basis for the negotiation of future initiatives. So I think this idea that we're hearing from multiple states of how different measures can be complementary is very helpful, and it moves away from that belief that every single initiative stands on its own. So again, this idea of building blocks that eventually will build that end goal that is PAROS, I think is really useful to keep that in mind as we continue to have these conversations. I am going to hand the floor now to Jessica Talk to provide perhaps a contrasting view of what we just heard. The United States, on the other hand, is a country that voted against Resolution 77-250. So I would love to hear your view of this upcoming process. Is there any particular challenges that you foresee? How can these be mitigated? Or just in general, your views and your ideas of this upcoming GD. Jessica, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Almudena, and thank you to Almudena and UNIDIR for what is going to be, I think, a very deeply interesting panel. I've listened carefully to the speakers before me and do have some associated remarks, which will largely focus on the ideas of complementarity and flexibility, which to some extent echo the remarks of the panels before this. However, before we get into the political and legal character of this discussion, I want to set a little bit of context by taking a snapshot of the development over the last 5 to 10 years of what has been happening in space, which we have not yet discussed in much detail today. First, I want to talk about the perceptions of and value from space. As many as the space community know, public perceptions of space have changed massively in the last 10 years. For example, in the 1960s, the general public saw space as solely for exploration, but now, nearly 60 years later, the public is starting to recognize their daily reliance on space capabilities. They use GPS or other positioning, navigation, and timing satellites to navigate to restaurants. They know that NASA is experimenting with saving the Earth from asteroids through their DART program. They've watched with wonder as countries have landed rovers and now even helicopters on Mars, and we all held our breath as we watched India's recent landing on the moon in the South Pole. They're starting even to realize that some of their weather, radio, communications, and TV programming, even Wi-Fi on airplanes, is dependent on satellites. So the general public is starting even to realize that space debris is really dangerous, which is a huge realization given that people tend not to think about challenges to infrastructure on a daily basis. But before I move on, I would like to point out that the U.S. Department of Defense has been underpinning global spaceflight safety since 2010 by providing space situational awareness information about satellite locations and potential collisions with debris, offered to everyone at spacetrack.org for free, and that one of the long-standing sources of GPS is U.S. military satellites. These are two very easy examples of why the military use of space is not equal to inherently aggressive use, and why we continue to have these discussions today about what constitutes a weapon and what does not. But back to the subject at hand. All of this change has only really occurred in the last decade or so, and much of it just in the past 5 years. So against this backdrop of rapid development, here comes a 45-year-old goal of, quote, prevention of an arms race in outer space, which was adopted, as someone said earlier, in 1978 by the first special session devoted for disarmament, commonly called SSOD1. I'd like to dig a little bit deeper into that. We can ask ourselves, what is an arms race? What, in fact, is an armament in the space environment? Can weapons deployed on the ground drive an arms race in outer space? What about cyber attacks? The internet wasn't even a thing in 1978. What about threatening rhetoric from countries that claim that satellites are legitimate targets? Finally, is the concept of an arms race still a valid measure of progress when compared to the serious technological and geopolitical changes that have occurred? Acknowledging these changes, the U.S. Space Priority Framework states that, quote, as activities evolve, the norms, rules, and principles that guide outer space activities must also evolve, end quote. While the United States continues to value and support that goal of PAROS, this theoretical notion of, quote, arms racing does not provide a useful framework about how we should consider and deal with the perceptions of immediate and current threats to or from a space system. Frequently, we, especially in my department, find ourselves wrestling with practical problems such as miscommunication, misunderstanding, and high potential for miscalculation. All of these have the potential to escalate what used to be tensions into conflict. So with regard to the concept of further practical measures, we would agree, as some other states remind us, that the existing legal framework certainly has room to be supplemented and expanded. That is where the concept of preventing conflict in outer space, as contained in the Secretary General's work related to the new Agenda for Peace, is useful to consider. But back to PAROS, I think really the main point of contention between the two camps on this issue is how that framework would best be supplemented and expanded in terms of both substance and procedure, the timing of the approach, which may include, as Michael noted earlier, sequentiality. In speaking of compromise, we have some states setting up the idea that we must be bound to a single path, that is, the immediate negotiation of legally binding measures. This is the premise behind the further practical measures language. But those same states have demonstrated a willingness to limit any progress by refusing to compromise or take into account the diverse set of perspectives that can enhance international peace and security. It is important to remember that these issues are complex and will require careful and deliberate study that takes into account the views of affected stakeholders. In both the Space Security Fora and in UN COPUOS, very new capabilities such as active debris removal or mission life extension are just starting to be discussed due to their implications for both areas. While we all seek to quickly develop norms, rules, and principles of responsible behavior, including those that would contribute to a future legally binding instrument, we must do so in a thorough, meticulous, and inclusive manner, rather than rush through recommendations which may result in unintended consequences or inadvertently constrain new or novel activities. We owe ourselves a thoughtful, deliberative process. In the United States, and I know I've had a lot of proverbs today, so I apologize, we have a saying that, quote, a rising tide lifts all boats, end quote, meaning that any overall progress or improvement will benefit all participants. As you heard in the panel before us, there are a diversity of stakeholders finding new mechanisms, such as the OEWG on reducing space threats through norms, rules, and principles of responsible behaviors, to be useful and helpful towards achieving the goals of PAROS, as well as for reducing the potential for conflict. It suggests that many states are willing to consider new methods that allow for the potential of progress towards the negotiation of a future instrument. Transparency and confidence building measures and norms, rules, and principles of responsible behavior can promote common understandings regarding activities undertaken in outer space when operating in accordance with existing international law. As we heard repeatedly on the first panel, we must continue to work on developing an understanding around the expectations and standards that the international community has in the use of these national security space systems. And it is important that this process move forward in an inclusive manner in parallel with others. Moreover, this progression is historically consistent. As a case in point, in 1961, the UNGA passed the political commitments found in Resolution 1721, quote, international cooperation in the peaceful uses of outer space, end quote. Several of this resolution's preambular and operative paragraphs became foundational language for the 1967 Outer Space Treaty. These agreements did not spring up overnight, but took time and deliberation. With specific regard to the further practical measures resolution, I was honored to be one of the advisors to that U.S. expert in 2018 and 2019 iteration of the PAROS GGE. And I can say that despite voting against the measure both then and more recently in 2022, the United States continues to participate constructively and openly in these processes. We did not go in with an antagonistic or pre-decided approach to that GGE. It is well known that the United States votes no against the annual UN resolution on no first placement, and though we think the PPWT is flawed. Despite that, the United States comes into these processes open to having the conversation on any issue that any country is willing to discuss. We do feel that it is important to allow a conversation on all of these approaches and measures we can take to address this issue, not just limiting ourselves to one narrow approach. In closing, I've covered the benefits from space, discussed the evolution of PAROS, and discussed the broadly popular notion that among a diverse cross-section of states that there is complementarity between one, voluntary, non-legally binding measures, which includes TCBMs and the OEWG's norms, rules, and principles approach, and two, the pursuit of legally binding measures. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jessica. I'm really liking the fact that I'm hearing across panelists this word all the time, the issue of complementarity, which you also mentioned, the fact that we cannot limit ourselves to one approach, but rather that there can be multiple ways to achieve that one goal. I also like this point that you made about how I feel that states in general agree that PAROS is a worthy goal, but it's the disagreement is not on the goal itself, but rather how we can best achieve it. So the fact that we're talking about complementarity more and more, I think it's very positive. And I hope that it will get us closer to that goal as we continue to have these discussions. I will now give the floor to Bassem Hassan. I know that Egypt has also voted in favor of this resolution 77-250. So we would love to hear your view on this initiative. And I feel if you'd like to also speak on this, because you also participated in the 2019 GD, I should also ask, how do you think that states can build on past processes such as that GD, perhaps following a little bit what Jessica already said about how the process went, and how do you feel that those discussions could help the discussion that we will be having in this upcoming GD?
Thank you, Almudena, and thanks to UNIDIR for convening this timely discussion. And it's indeed a privilege to be on this very distinguished panel, which I think is addressing the easiest set of questions as opposed to the other panels. But allow me at the outset to give a bit of context as well. From our point of view, I would like to start by a quote from Einstein, who once said that problems cannot be solved by the same way of thinking that created them in the first place. And this is very pertinent to the discourse on PAROS, and that is why the right framing of this discourse is essential for capturing the differences and complementarities between previous initiatives and for assessing where we stand and where we go from there. I think there are two essential distinctions that need to be made. First is the distinction between safety versus security aspects. As you all know, the long-term sustainability of the peaceful uses of outer space and preventing an arms race or conflicts require rules for both safety and security. While there are important synergies, complementarities, and interrelations between safety and security, each pillar is rather distinct and requires a specific set of tools and approaches to achieve it. Fortunately, a division of labor has already been developed within the existing multilateral framework We have the fourth committee and COPUS focusing on the safety of peaceful uses and international cooperation, while the first committee, including the various GGEs and OEWGs, the CD and the UNDC, address the security aspects and try to build upon and complement the existing international legal framework as contained in the relevant treaties. However, it could be argued that several states have been consistently trying to mainly focus on the safety aspects while attempting to slow down efforts that address the prevention of an arms race and related fundamental security threats. On the other hand, another group of states fear that addressing safety threatens making progress on security by legitimizing responsible weaponization in outer space. And in between these two groups, the vast majority of states, I would argue, and in particular in the non-aligned movement, believe that progress on both fronts is indeed mutually reinforcing. In order to achieve the desired progress, there is a pressing need for a comprehensive approach to address all threats while preserving this division of labor and ensuring the required complementarity. So if you can imagine a Venn diagram, on one circle you have the safety aspects, the other has the security aspects, but there is an intersection between the two, and there is an area that is inevitably going to be addressed, be it if you're addressing the safety concerns or the safety concerns. The other dichotomy or the other distinction that needs to be made is between the arms control versus disarmament approaches. On the security front, there are two competing approaches. The arms control approach is based on the logic that weaponization capabilities are inevitable and must be retained but regulated to sustain an envisioned strategic balance. The disarmament approach, on the other hand, aims at prohibiting certain behaviors and/or capabilities. While there could be some degree of complementarity between the two approaches in the short and medium term, experience from several domains has proven that arms control and risk reduction arrangements cannot be sustainable if disarmament is not their overarching long-term goal. At best, arms control arrangements should be viewed as possible enablers for disarmaments. There will always be new technological developments and newcomers, and this will shake the balance of arms control arrangements. Moreover, military outer space capabilities are only one element in the overall so-called strategic balance, which also depends on the balance in capabilities related to the nuclear weapons, other weapons of mass destruction, cyber warfare, missiles, ABMs, artificial intelligence, and the list goes on. Therefore, soft law and non-binding norms could be useful interim measures in the short term. However, they hardly yield the desired outcomes in the realm of security and arms control in the long term. So, without rules that are binding and reasonably verifiable, each actor will assume that others are developing their capabilities and that it has to follow suit to preserve its own security. And that is the very essence of an arms race. Honestly, the arguments against legally binding instruments are not so compelling. Appropriate definitions and verification mechanisms can and should be agreed upon at the negotiations themselves. And as many speakers before me have highlighted, a holistic and balanced approach is necessary for achieving the necessary progress. And that's exactly what we need to keep in mind as we approach the forthcoming process or processes that are trying to address these issues. Now, turning to some of the questions that you have posed to this panel on the preparation for the success of the new endeavors, including the newly established DGE. I think the first essential step is to build on the wealth of knowledge and previous proposals that are already there. Any effort should not start from scratch or simply duplicate efforts that have been conducted before. I will not cite the dozens of UNGA resolutions, the draft treaties, and the previous experiences of GGEs and OEWGs. Secondly, we must be cognizant of the recent developments, including, for example, that the disappointing inability to reach consensus on a final report at the open-ended working group recently will most probably cast some shadows on future endeavors in a manner that may require recalibrating our expectations, taking into account that this is the second consecutive incident where consensus on a final report gets blocked at the very last moment after very lengthy negotiations. Moreover, it's necessary to follow a comprehensive or holistic approach with an objective balance between safety versus security, disarmament versus arms control, and addressing both the threats related to the placement of weapons in outer space as opposed to the intentional use of force against space assets. To conclude, I would like to highlight that the all-or-nothing approach will not yield the results that we aspire for. None of these elements are mutually exclusive, but it's necessary to have a clear underpinning commitment to achieve the final objective, which is PAROS from all its aspects, as it's stated in the Egyptian annual resolution, including through legally binding instrument or instruments and trying to end the polarization and politicization surrounding this strategic topic. Last but not least, it's important to note that the mandate of this forthcoming GGE is not to elaborate a treaty, not to negotiate a treaty, but to elaborate elements. And with that in mind, we can easily say that it's not mandated to design a verification regime or come up with an exhaustive list of definitions. We can just set elements, and sometimes we can resort to that approach of listing options under each heading, not necessarily having an agreement on one way or the other, but listing the options so that they can be picked up by future negotiations when there is a political will to engage in such negotiations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Again, it is very heartening to see that mention of complementarity. I really liked what you said about how that all or nothing approach will not yield results, but we need a holistic and balanced approach. And we also need to build on the wealth of knowledge that we have already produced throughout these years in the space security field. I was also very pleased to hear how you contextualized the conversation at the very beginning of your presentation and how you talked about the differences and similarities that exist between space safety and space security. I love that image of the Venn diagram that you used. In UNIDA, we recently published a report on this issue, on the differences between and similarities between space security and space safety, and how different states are looking at their domestic policies, how they look at the relationship between these two concepts. And we reached the conclusion that another image that we could use to understand these two concepts is how they are two sides of the same coin, and that coin is the coin of space sustainability. So you need both space security and space safety to ensure that space sustainability can be achieved. So I hope that image is also useful for everyone here. I will now turn to Ambassador Shen. I know that China also voted in favor of Resolution 77-250. So again, as opposed to the same question that was posed to the previous panelists, I will pose now to you. What is your view of this process? What do you think potential challenges could be, and how they could be overcome to ensure that this process and future initiatives can also be successful? The floor is yours, Ambassador.
Thanks, Dina. Good afternoon, dear colleagues. Very glad to join this distinguished panel and participating in this year's Space Security Conference. I would like to share some of our thoughts on how best to prepare for the success of multilateral space security initiatives and try to answer Dina's questions you just raised. But first, let me begin by thanking UNIDA for hosting this event. My thanks also go to co-sponsors of this annual conference. A decade ago, during my previous posting here in Geneva, I participated in several space security conferences. Comparing with the conference at that time, I found no big change to the framework of the program of the conference, but the context and the content
within the conference and beyond the conference definitely have changed quite a lot, as Jessica just mentioned. In particular, some new processes and new initiatives have emerged on space security in recent years. And the geopolitical situation has also quite worsened. How to prepare for the success in future multilateral space security and meet the challenges? With fresh memories of a recent OEWG meeting and old memories of my previous work on relevant issues, especially when I work on the elements of the PPWT quite some time ago, I would like to offer some of the following some observations. First observation, we should draw lessons from past for success in the future. The negotiation of a legally binding instrument on prevention of an arms race in outer space are long overdue. In the Conference on Disarmament, the Group of Governmental Experts on PAROS established in 2018 failed to, at the last moment, just weeks ago. The open-ended working group on reducing space threats also failed to reach a consensus report. What are the fundamental causes for the stalemate for these processes and efforts? Firstly, lack of mutual trust among major stakeholders, major power competition, Cold War mentality, pursuance of military doctrine of dominance or even hegemony in outer space do not facilitate political will to launch and proceed the negotiation of a legally binding instrument. Secondly, lack of common understanding on space security threats. Many states, including China, have serious concerns on the increasing risk of weaponization of outer space and turning outer space into battlefield, which is arising from some strategy or policy for dominance in outer space and defining outer space as warfighting domain, as well as the military build-up for preparing a space war. On the other hand, some states prefer to focus on safety issues, such as space debris and collision. Different states have different understanding on what constitute the immediate and the fundamental threats to space security. Thirdly, divergent approaches in addressing threats to space security and preventing an arms race in outer space. Many states highlight that the negotiation of a legally binding instrument on PAROS is the only effective way to safeguarding space security, while others prefer non-binding norms, rules, and principles. Some states advocate that transparency and confidence-building measures should be complementary, or rather than a substitute for legally binding instrument, while others emphasize that the TCBM and LBI are just complementary. So there are at least three approaches in addressing these issues. My second observation, we need to build on existing achievements for success in future initiatives. Although the existing processes on space security are facing realistic challenges, including the upcoming GGE, we witness some positive trend and elements in multilateral processes on space security in recent years. There is at least common understanding that all states should contribute actively to the objective of peaceful use of outer space, to prevention of an arms race in outer space, and to refrain from actions contrary to relevant existing treaties in the interest of maintaining international peace and security. The international community has attached unprecedentedly high level of importance to safeguarding space security, and there is increasing enthusiasm among all parties for enhancing global governance on space security. I arrived just 3 weeks. Originally, I thought that the nuclear issue will be the most pressing issue, but over the past 3 weeks, most discussions have been focusing on space issue. But something to do with OEWG and something to do with new initiatives to be tabled in the first committee. But it demonstrates that the international community indeed attached very much importance to this issue. The substantive discussions in different platforms, such as the Conference on Disarmament, the UNDC, and the UNGGE and PAROS, have yielded some positive progress. Of course, I would be unbalanced if I did not mention the OEWG. The substantive discussions also took place in the OEWG, though with divergent and even opposing views and positions. Quite like Jessica mentioned, we voted against the resolution, but China participated I think quite constructively in the whole process, though we still have different views. The UNDC this year reached by consensus recommendations on TCBM, which reiterates that TCBM could complement and contribute to, rather than substitute for, legally binding instrument on PAROS. In 2022, a subsidiary body to the CDE on PAROS also adopted a consensus report which emphasizes the importance of concerted efforts on space security issues. The 2019 PAROS GGE had comprehensive and in-depth consideration of substantive elements of a legally binding instrument, such as principles, obligations, definitions, and verification, which laid a solid basis for the upcoming GGE. I also need to mention that the PPWT submitted and updated in 2008 and 2014, respectively, is still the only proposal for a legally binding instrument on the table, which could serve as a good basis for future negotiations. This is an open document, as we always emphasize that. Once negotiation or pre-negotiation is launched, there will be further discussions on some of the key issues raised by many stakeholders. These positive elements and achievements in the past could be built on for the success of the future space security initiatives. My third observation, the success of future space security initiatives relies on a holistic or comprehensive efforts guided by right principles and direction. A new GGE on PAROS will begin this work this November. Ideas of follow-up processes to the recently concluded OEWG and further practical measures for the prevention of an arms race in outer space are also floating around. To ensure success of these initiatives, we need to improve top-level design of the entire architecture. First and foremost, we should stick to the fundamental goal of PAROS. The outcome document of SSOD1 clearly states that in order to prevent an arms race in outer space, further measures should be taken and appropriate international negotiation held. We believe that all initiatives should firmly stick to the goal of PAROS and focus on the discussion of on substantial elements which will contribute to a legally binding instrument, so as to lay a solid foundation for the early commencement of negotiation thereof. Secondly, we should uphold the vision of common security. China has put forward its initiative, Global Security Initiative, which advocates a vision of common, comprehensive, cooperative, and sustainable security. This also applies to security in space and will guide China's efforts in the relevant area, including the space security area. We welcome all parties to support and join this initiative. We should safeguard the common security interests in outer space through cooperation and dialogue, and address threats to space security in a comprehensive and balanced manner. Cold War mentality and selective approaches are doomed to fail. Pursuing one's own security at the cost of others will only undermine security for all. Thirdly, we should streamline or reconcile the multiple processes on the outer space security governance. The mandates of COPIUS and other platforms should be respected so as to avoid duplicating or interfering their normal work. Meanwhile, we should enhance the mutual complementarity among different processes, such as the GGE on PAROS and the proposed follow-up processes on reducing space threats, as people usually refer to. Keeping in mind that negotiation of a legally binding instrument on PAROS should be set as a priority, I would just now, whether it's only pass for negotiation of a legally binding instrument, I would say that will be a direction or the ultimate goal of a legally binding instrument to prevent arms race in outer space. But in achieving this goal, different efforts and can be reconciled, and therefore I mentioned the holistic and comprehensive approach to deal with the relevant issues. In conclusion, outer space concerns the security and the welfare of humanity and embodies the essence of a community of shared future for humankind. I sincerely hope that through this conference and similar discussions, we will accumulate and consolidate common understandings on PAROS and maintaining space security and make valuable contributions to safeguarding lasting peace and tranquility in outer space. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I truly hope that we can reach that common understanding that you mentioned as well. I fully agree with you that it is a very positive trend that states are increasingly acknowledging the importance of using and exploring space for peaceful uses. And also the importance of PAROS. And we are seeing this increasingly, not just among spacefaring states, but amongst emerging spacefaring actors and also non-spacefaring states. So I think that's really positive. And I agree with you that the space security discussion is becoming increasingly important among the members of the international community. You also made a mention to the need for holistic and complementary efforts, which other panelists mentioned as well. So even though we have different perspectives in this panel, that has been one word or one idea that I've heard repeatedly. So at least maybe we can say that there is common understanding when it comes to that, which I think is very positive. And I also like the point that you made about using past experiences and use them as lessons from which we can learn as we work towards future initiatives or future mechanisms that can help us achieve space security and reach that goal of PAROS. This discussion has been incredibly interesting, and we have taken longer than maybe I would have thought initially to cover all of these very important ideas. So we don't have a lot of time for questions, unfortunately. I am not going to ask any questions of my own initially, because I do really want to open the floor and give the people here in Geneva, as well as those attending virtually, the opportunity to ask questions. If there are no questions, I do definitely have questions of my own, but I nevertheless do want to open the floor in case somebody else wants that chance. So I see Dimitri, please, the floor is yours. I see Dima, and I also see, yes, the representative from Pakistan. Maybe we could take those two questions and the panelists could reply to them in a joint fashion. Dimitri, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, I hope you can hear me well. Actually, I have a very short question to Jessica Talk. I might misunderstood, but was the message about arms racing as it is not that relevant these days, and that arms racing as a concept is not that important for space security? Because I'm a bit surprised. Eventually, we can move to the fact that there is no security dilemma in space and so on. I understand that looking at practical steps might be very important, but just moving away from PAROS also sounds a bit strange to me. Yeah, that's it. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dimitri. I will give the floor to Pakistan to ask his question, and I also see Secure World Foundation has a question as well. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. A very interesting conversation. I'll try to be very brief, just to ask a question that any panelist can respond to. One theme that has emerged from different statements and interventions is this issue of the crisis of framing that we are undergoing these days on which approach is relevant. Now, this message that we have heard today as well, that there are threats or risks that could be parked under PAROS agenda item, Then there are dangers or risks that need to be addressed through the COPUS platform as well. Then there are overlaps that comes in the Venn diagram that Bassam has also mentioned. So are there any other risks, how to address those overlaps? Perhaps those addressing those overlaps could complement these two efforts that need to be undertaken within PAROS and within COPUS as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Victoria, the floor is yours.
Thank you. My question is for Konstantin. I don't know if he's still on, but this is about no first placement. It's a very quick two-parter. One, he said that there were 30 countries that had done the no first placement pledge. I'm wondering, just as a researcher, I would love to see a list of that somewhere, and if they can point us to that, that'd be really helpful. The other thing is that he said that the U.S. and 34 other countries' commitment to not to conduct direct-to-send anti-satellite missile tests isn't very helpful because it's just purely declaratory. And I'd love to hear how that pledge is any different from a no first placement pledge, which also appears to be just purely declaratory. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we're going to start with Dimitri's question for Jessica, which was on arms racing. The floor is yours, Jessica.
So I think maybe I'm not sure if there's a misunderstanding, but I think what we're trying to indicate when I question, PAROS, I'm not questioning the aspect of it, right? The United States continues to value that goal, right? We value and support that goal to prevent the arms race in outer space, as we have the entire time after SSOD since 1978. I think what we're trying to say is that there's a second aspect to it, right? It is not necessarily just the focus on an arms race because, fundamentally you get down to the point of, and I think some of the other presenters sort of touched on it, what is an arm, right? Like, what is an armament? And then we get into the discussions, and as somebody has, as Helmut indicated earlier, then you have 40 years of stalemate to some extent. What constitutes a weapon? How do you place one? What is the placement in outer space, et cetera? And these things are not necessarily helpful in terms of the practical things that we've seen, And so I just want to take an example with, our Chinese colleagues. So recently, the Chinese towed a satellite to graveyard orbit. To the United States, does that look like a threat, right? Was that declared ahead of time? What was that operation? When we saw it, we said, oh my gosh, what are they doing? And then we said, okay, well, maybe that looks responsible. But there are a lot of questions around that, right? And there's a lot of questions that could cause miscommunication. The act of it, like how fast was it? Where was it going? We had no idea what was going on. We had to rely on our own sensors to find out, to try and figure out what the intent was. And so to some people, that's eminently responsible behavior, right? They've disposed of a satellite. To others, the question is, was that transparent? What does that mean in terms of capability development, et cetera? And so the notion itself, theoretically, of arms race, yes, it sort of applies to that, but it does not fit this day-to-day. Can we look to behaviors to determine intent? Can we institute TCBMs or have some other sort of approach that basically help us solve these practical everyday issues so that we can reduce the risks, right? We can reduce the threats that we are perceiving, because fundamentally a lot of these threats are really subjective. Thanks.
So I will now give the floor to Konstantin, who is with us online, to answer the question on the No First Placement initiative. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Almudena, and thank you very much for this question, Victoria. So first of all, I would like to say that I'm not in a position to speculate about any kind of contradiction between the NFP initiative and ASAT initiative. I would like also to highlight that the nature of these initiatives is quite different, and this history of these initiatives is quite different. So the NFP initiative, the reason for the NFP initiative was the ultimate goal adopted in the relevant UNGA resolution. I mean the prevention of the placement of weapons in outer space and weaponization of outer space in general. And the NFP initiative was as an intermediate transparency and confidence building measure, political commitment, in order to make the step towards the fulfillment of this goal to prevent the placement of weapons in outer space and to ban the placement of weapons, finally by adopting a legally binding norm about that. And the NFP was the initiative in order to ensure that if all the spacefaring nations would join this initiative and hopefully the whole international community would join this initiative, the problem of the placement of weapons in outer space would be solved. If we are talking about the ASAT initiative, it is the initiative that is not even about anti-satellite capabilities in general. It is about one tiny activity with regard to this capability, and it was proposed by the country that does not have any intention to make this kind of activities because this country made it in the past and doesn't need to make this testing on anti-satellite capability, with anti-satellite capabilities. So in this case, that's why we consider this ASAT initiative as purely declaratory initiative, because we do not see any practical steps behind this initiative that would be done by the countries that are proposing this initiative and that join this initiative. Because as we know, these countries, even before proposing this initiative, didn't have any kind of plans to fulfill this kind of testing. So that's why we do not see that it is that these two initiatives could be perceived from practical point of view in the same manner. Because if we are talking about the NFP initiative, it is the initiative that would have the real practical consequences, even taking into account the current list of states joined this initiative. I mean, for example, for the Russian Federation, it is quite a strong commitment to not to place weapons first in outer space. So I mean, it just, for us, it is the commitment not to place even one really huge type of capabilities that would affect the strategic stability and international security. And that's why we are proposing for all the spacefaring nations to join this initiative in order to commit not to place weapons in outer space and to solve the problem of the weapons, of the placement of weapons in outer space. As for a ASAT initiative, we think that it's not so comprehensive to talk just about ASAT testing. We need to talk about the whole range of anti-satellite capabilities, and I would like to say the whole range of counter-space capabilities in this case, in order to provide the real comprehensive character to any kind of such initiatives, and in order to ensure that these initiatives would have the practical consequences and practical meaning for the international security and strategic stability. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Konstantin. So now we're going to move on to the last question posed by the delegate of Pakistan, which was about that Venn diagram that Bassem talked to us about and how we can address those overlaps that exist between space safety and space security. And I'm going to give the floor first to you, Bassem. The floor is yours.
Thank you. And I would like to underscore that this overlap or the framing issue is not a dilemma or a crisis at all. And my own understanding is that even the two sides of this debate, focusing on safety or security, are fully cognizant of the right framing. The problem arises that during the discussions, due to sometimes the lack of objectivity, this becomes very contested. Nevertheless, what I'm proposing here is that in any future discussion, there needs to be some degree of readiness to accept the inclusion of certain elements that are viewed to be safety related in a security debate and vice versa, at least when it comes to that intersection. But in the same time, when it comes to hardcore security concerns, namely when it comes to issues like the placement or ASAT capabilities, the intentional destruction of outer space assets, the relevant obligations need to be underpinned by legally binding obligations and some degree of verification. On other issues or concerns, you can accept softer approach, TCBMs. And there are many examples in existing disarmament treaties where you have this without calling them that way, but in that treaty, you will find TCBMs that are in the treaty, but not subject to verification, not subject to a very hard, low approach. And I think for all disarmament experts, we know for a fact that the toolbox of disarmament is quite rich, and you know how to address each concern through the right tool and approach. The Outer Space Treaty itself, for example, it has a verification measure on the prohibition of the placement of WMDs in outer space. It has never been utilized, and the treaty itself lacks any definition of what a WMD is. In the MPT, TPNW, CTBT, there is no definition of what a nuclear weapon is. But yet, these are very effective treaties that have been adhered to for decades. And I think everyone in the room would agree that this has been an approach that was very successful. And in those same treaties, there are provisions that refer to certain TCBMs, consultation mechanisms, if there are disputes. They're not fully binding. They're optional for the states parties to resort to if they find necessary. And this is exactly the approach that we need. We need a track that recognizes that the threats are multiple. They come in different forms, and each form of threat or concern can and should be addressed by the appropriate tool. Now, before I conclude, I heard in previous panels this comparison between GGEs and OEWGs, which one is more comprehensive and all that, and I would like to very briefly weigh in on that. I think in the realm of disarmament in particular, GGEs have been an indispensable tool. They have yielded so many beneficial results. In that one experience that I participated at on PAROS in particular, that draft report was, I would argue, one of the most advanced attempts. If you look at it, and the document is available, it really covered a lot of grounds, and it can provide very useful elements for any future discussions. Furthermore, this report, after the failure to endorse it by the GGE itself, was endorsed by the African group. So it's not just now 25 experts in their individual capacity, but 53 states have endorsed that report and submitted it in a working paper to the UNDC before. In open-ended working group as an inclusive mechanism, if you look carefully at the room, especially when it comes to very technical issues, most probably you will find between 15 and 25 delegations that are quite active in the interactive discussion itself, other than making pre-prepared statements. But at the end of the day, sometimes GGEs are quite helpful and they are not exclusive. Eventually, the mandates of these GGEs require open-ended consultations with the whole membership that is conducted in the intersessional period. It's open to receive inputs from states if they wish to submit papers or something. So I just wanted to stay away from this comparison between the two mechanisms and not to start a contest on which process is more conducive to yield outcomes or not. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that. I would now like to offer the floor to the rest of the panelists to address this question if they wish to do so, and especially to offer everybody here and joining us virtually some closing thoughts. I would kindly ask you to be brief if you can. So let's start with my immediate left with Michael. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. So maybe just to very briefly touch on some of these questions. First, on the conceptual discussions, the concept of PAROS, the concept of responsible behavior, I think it continues to be important to discuss. I think on the notion of PAROS, I think Jessica raised an important point about the fact that when you start analytically examining this, maybe it doesn't exactly always address all of the contemporary challenges, emerging technologies, and the threats that might be encompassed in a comprehensive initiative. This was something, in fact, that was discussed in the 2018-2019 GGE. But in any case, even an initiative is quite broadly focused, as the Open-Ended Working Group was nonetheless submitted under the General Assembly's agenda item on prevention of an arms race in outer space. And so I think there's always been clarity that under this umbrella term, we can have quite a broad discussion on many different concepts. And these concepts don't need to limit the discussion in any way. This was the practice, and in fact, that the 2018-2019 GGE followed. In terms of coordination, again, we have really, recognized this sort of problem of framing, as our Pakistani colleague mentioned. The joint meetings of the first and fourth committee have been, one mechanism for, addressing coordination where these overlaps. And then, I just want to also recall on the examples that Peter Martinez gave this morning, areas in which mechanisms that have been developed in Vienna can effectively, implement concepts and address problems that have been, discussed in a security context. And so part of the solution is just ensuring proper coordination between the bodies, making sure that different delegations in both locations are kept up to speed and what everybody's doing, so that there is coordination. And then finally, just to kind of conclude, Al-Mudena has mentioned several times, many of us have used the word complementarity. I would say another takeaway is comprehensiveness, being able to have spaces that everybody and all of their different threat perceptions and different preferred means of addressing those threats can be addressed all together. I think there was another proposal, a suggestion from the Chinese Ambassador Shen that streamlining these processes can also be one way of ensuring comprehensiveness as well. So I would add that word to the list of things that I hope that we can start to converge around. But thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Michael. I'm going to move on to Jessica, please. The floor is yours.
Thanks. Just to echo what Michael and Peter Martinez said this morning, and I actually want to point out some specific language actually on how we deal with these overlaps between the two committees, as well as the first and fourth committee meetings. I'd like to point specifically to the 2013 GGE report. So it's too bad Victor Vasiliev could not join us today, but Peter did touch on it. That being said, it's specifically para 13 out of that out of those 25 experts who said the GGE recognized the active participation of member states and UN COPUOS in the development of those guidelines. By that, they meant the LTS guidelines. And this is out of the GGE report. Also noting that, quote, these guidelines will have characteristics similar to those of transparency and confidence building measures. Some of them could be considered as potential TCBMs, while others could provide the technical basis for the implementation of certain TCBMs proposed by this GGE. So even 10 years ago, they saw that there was complementarity between even the two groups. And so, as Bassam said earlier, these are certainly areas that we should look at where those overlaps actually can be addressed by both committees, while one can look at the same thing like sharing contact information. That's important for both the security realm, and it's equally important for peaceful uses. And just to wrap up, I think I said earlier that, the United States ultimately comes to these things and we say, we're going to discuss whatever you want openly. We look forward to continuing this conversation, whether in the PAROS GGE or COPUOS or any number of the multilateral fora that exist. We will certainly discuss these issues. We will try and do so openly, flexibly, constructively. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jessica. I'm going to give the floor for his wrap-up remarks to Ambassador Chen. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Amjina, and I will be very brief, and I have mentioned what I want to say in the beginning. Just as a wrap-up and also respond to some of the questions and the comments, I would like to highlight 2 points. The first is about the perception, the right perception. Just now, the issue of whether there is the concept of arms race in outer space. I would say the wrong perception might lead to further arms race in outer space. For example, like I mentioned, indicated a little bit, how do we interpret, as China interpret, U.S. space doctrines or military space force build up? It will be interpreted by China and will probably lead to a certain kind of arms race in outer space. So we also believe that the doctrines, the intentions are very important. That's why we, on various occasions, highlight this point. And also the perception to regard another country or other countries as strategic adversaries will also lead to a worsening geopolitical situation, which ended up in arms race in different areas. This is one point. The second point I want to highlight is the importance of negotiation of legally binding instruments. I think such kind of instrument can provide predictability and also a framework for every issue, for a wide range of issues that can be dealt with, including the issue Jessica just mentioned, notifications or explanations, clarifications through proper channels. We also had to bear in mind the different committees and the different instruments have different authorities dealing with the issue. There might be some overlapping issues. The point I want to make is that once we have a legal binding instrument, then it will provide a very solid framework to addressing many of the threats or the issues raised during this conference. And also, such kind of instrument will be quite comprehensive, including TCBMs, including norms, rules, and other principles. So, as a final point, and advertising for the PPWT, I do hope that every participant can read our PPWD again, you will find that there are many elements that might be useful and can be a good basis for further discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And last but not least, Konstantin, who is with us virtually, the floor is yours for some wrap-up remarks.
Thank you very much, Almudena, and thank you, colleagues, for your comments. They are quite relevant, I could tell you. I would like also to add some words about this question about which many colleagues talked today, about this issue of complementarity or the issue of comprehensive character of the discussion. So from my side, I would like to say that I do not see any contradiction between different approaches, actually, because there are no, from my point of view, different approaches. There is just one approach. And we are talking about all the same things. We are talking about the prevention of an arms race in outer space. The only difference in these different proposals, I mean the proposal on so-called responsible behavior and the proposal of the development of a legally binding instrument, is the form of these norms and principles to ensure PAROS, and whether to make it in voluntary measures, by voluntary measures, or to make it by legally binding norms. I do not see any contradiction with that, and I think that the GGE would cover these two issues. First of all, the elaboration of the legally binding norms on to ensure PAROS goals, but also to cover the issue of TCBMs as an element, as a future element of a possible legally binding instrument. And saying TCBMs, I mean these voluntary measures that is different principles on in order to ensure PAROS, or principles of outer space activities. So here I do not see any kind of contradiction, and we could not talk about the complementarity. I agree with Michael, we should talk about the comprehensive character of this discussion in this case. That should be anchored to the ultimate goal of a legally binding instrument, but of course the TCBMs should be further studied and explored as intermediate measures in order to ensure PAROS, and also in order to ensure the development of a legally binding instrument as a future element of this agreement, a future agreement. With regard to the copiers and other issues, I do agree with Jessica about the different provisions from 2013 GGE report on TCBMs. Of course, these TCBMs related to the copious problematics should be further explored and implemented in line with the understandings included in this 2013 GGE report. But I see that the main problem here is where these different TCBMs should be discussed and should be elaborated. And of course, copious is a relevant venue if we are talking about outer space activities for peaceful purposes. And different TCBMs related directly to outer space activities for peaceful purposes that are in line with the copious mandate should be definitely discussed and developed at the copious venue. If we are talking about different TCBMs related directly to PAROS issues, related to the Geneva problematics, so-called Geneva problematics, so they should be discussed in the PAROS formats. And in this case, I do not see any contradiction with the 2013 report when we are talking about copiers and non-copiers. And with regard to the future newly established GGE, I could tell you that, of course, the GGE, the discussion in this GGE should be based on the deliverables made by copiers, on different measures and understandings with regard to the outer space activities in peaceful purposes. And last but not least, I would like also to touch the issue of inclusivity and the format of GGE. Here I would like to agree with Basim about the specificity of the format of the GGE. And here I would like to say that this format of the GGE is totally relevant for the aim and for the goal of the newly established GGE. So I mean, first of all, it is the intention to give the opportunity for the independent experts to discuss these issues, to consider these issues without any politicization in their personal capacity, without any kind of political strings attached, and in order to have the opportunity to provide for the UN member states, for the international community, the recommendations on several elements, set of elements for a future legally binding instrument in order to take the first step in this discussion, in this long journey towards a legally binding instrument, including, of course, the different issues related to these legally binding instruments, also on TCBMs. So I see that at this stage, this GGE would be another attempt to initiate this discussion by experts, but of course it doesn't exclude any further efforts that could be made by the UN member states in the open-ended format or in any kind of format in order to continue this discussion for developing a legally binding instrument on PAROS, including the placement of weapons in outer space and the threat or use of force in outer space, from outer space, or against outer space. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Konstantin. Unfortunately, we have reached the end of our time. In fact, we have gone over time, for which I apologize, but I believe that the discussions were very rich and very interesting, so I think it was worth it, and I hope that all of you present here agree with me. However, we have reached the end of day one of the Outer Space Security Conference. So I wanted to thank the panelists for this panel 3. This has been such a pleasure to moderate such an excellent group of experts.